Welcome back, everybody. And this is Women in Lit, and we are working on persuasion. I hope that you've been able to get through at least the first part of the text, which is what I wanted to talk about today. As you know, I've given an extension on the forums, so you've got up until 48 hours to respond to that. So hopefully that'll make things a little bit easier for you. And I will have your journals on Frankenstein back to you shortly if I haven't already returned them to you. And what I will do is have your journal on persuasion due the 18th at midnight via email, PDF, or Word. Though certainly if you need a little bit more time, just let me know and I'd be happy to do that, with a date of the 23rd being our due date, or at least our hopeful due date for the first paper. But again, if we need a little bit more time with that, that would be fine as well. And what I've done in the notes, as you can see, is that I've put together a list of characters. I'm well aware that it's difficult to keep track of all of the characters and all of their relationships with one another. There are lots of different ways I could have divided this up, but I decided to divide it up based on gender, with a list of the major male characters and then a list of the major female characters. And as you can see, it begins with Sir Walter Elliot as our major male character that we're first introduced to in the novel. He is a widower, and the major question in the text is, will he remarry? And there are concerns that if he does remarry, he could have a male heir, and that means that all of the fortune and the property would go to that male heir. As we learn early on in the book, he has 3 daughters, and he had a young son who had died. So basically, his estate is not likely to go to any of his immediate family members. It'll probably go to what they're calling the heir presumptive, which is the closest male heir to the family, which happens to be the male cousin. And that's William Elliot, Esquire. And he is basically a attorney. He doesn't have status, and he doesn't have the class that Sir Walter Elliot does. As a sir, he is part of the landed gentry. He is basically one of the lowest orders of nobility. And we can see how he's trying to maintain his station and also trying to improve his station throughout the course of the text. And we're also introduced to Charles Musgrove, as I have in number 2 on our list for male characters. He's married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter, who happens to be Mary. And he had once proposed to Anne. She turned him down because she didn't want to marry if she didn't feel love. And this romantic idea of love was rather revolutionary for this time period, especially within this class, where individuals married for status and they married for political reasons. They didn't necessarily marry for romantic reasons. And we definitely see that in terms of how Sir Walter Elliot feels about the courtship of his daughters. We're also introduced to, as a male character, Frederick Wentworth. And Frederick Wentworth was the former suitor to Anne, which she turned down. She was persuaded. That's part of the title for persuasion. She was persuaded by Lady Elliot, who is a family friend and serves as a kind of mother figure to Anne, not to marry Frederick Wentworth because he hadn't established enough fortune and status for himself. But Wentworth, and his last name is telling, he went and found his worth. He was able to establish himself in the Navy and acquire quite a bit of fortune, as well as acquire rank. And that's one of the tensions in this novel, is the fear that individuals could be able to basically improve their lot in life, not through their birthright, but through effort. And in this particular instance, it's through the military. And we see that he is also the brother to Mrs. Croft, who ends up renting Kellynch Hall from Sir Walter Elliot. Now, it might seem like a bit of too much coincidence to have the connections between these characters. But then we also have to remember that they lived in a rather small world, in the sense that they didn't have access to travel in the way that we ourselves have access to travel. So basically they had limited social circles, especially because not only were they limited by geography, but they were also limited based on their class, that there were certain individuals that they could and could not socialize with. So it's not terribly surprising that we see these sorts of connections between all of them. The major question in the novel is, who will Frederick Wentworth court and ultimately marry? Now that he has went and found his worth, he's a single male and he basically is eligible to marry. And we already talked a little bit about William Elliot. He ended up marrying outside of the family for money. And that was something that was considered to be rather dishonorable. Now that he has money and he no longer has to worry about his wife because he's a widower, now he can think about status, and it seems that that is what is propelling his interest in the Elliot family. So in other words, as we continue to read the novel, we see that he really doesn't have much character. As we go on, Mr. Musgrove, this is Charles Musgrove's father, and he happens to be married. I did take the time in these lists to indicate the characters that were married and the characters who were single, because while this novel is very much a commentary, a satire, if you will, on class, it also is a romance novel. And it's a question of, based on the eligible individuals in that geographic region and who would be appropriate matches based on social status, how are they going to basically formulate their pairings? So in this particular instance, we see that Charles Musgrove's father is married already, and that means that he's not part of the tensions in this novel about relationships. Then we also learn about Admiral Croft. He rents Kellynch Hall from Sir Walter, and he happens to be married to Mrs. Croft, and he is part of this new version of military that allows individuals to acquire rank and status on their own. It's one of the reasons why Sir Walter decides that he can rent to Admiral Croft, because Admiral Croft has some kind of a title, so he's somewhat respectable, but he isn't going to overshadow Sir Walter. And we see from the very beginning how pompous and arrogant and self-centered Sir Walter is. So he surrounds himself with mirrors and is completely obsessed with appearance. So we see that Admiral Croft is a very different kind of person than Sir Walter. At any rate, the other male characters we're introduced to later on, Captain Harville, who happens to be Frederick Wentworth's friend, and Captain Harville happens to be married. But another friend, Captain Benwick, who is friends with Captain Harville, has lost his fiancée. She's died. In other words, he's single. So the question is, will he court again? And if so, whom will he court? And then lastly, we have Charles Hayter. He's the Musgrove family cousin. He's single, and he's courting Henrietta Musgrove. So she's one of the single females. And as you can see, as we go to the major female characters, beginning with the first female character in terms of birth, that would be Elizabeth Elliot, and that would be Sir Walter's oldest daughter. She's single. She's not currently courting anybody, and it doesn't seem like Sir Walter is terribly concerned about that. She sort of has taken on the role of the homemaker now that her mother has died. So she's doing a fairly good job of taking care of her father, and her father assumes that eventually she will marry, even though she's in her late 20s, which is a very dangerous time for women during this time period. His major concern, or his major disappointment, I should say, is Anne Elliot, and that happens to be Sir Walter's middle daughter, who is still single. And the question is, who will ever want to court her now that she has lost her bloom? In other words, now that she is in her late 20s, 27, though she is younger than her sister Elizabeth, who's 29. But nevertheless, it seems that Anne has lost a beauty in the way that Elizabeth has not, or at least this is Sir Walter's impression of things. Mary Musgrove happens to be Sir Walter's youngest daughter. So she used to be Mary Elliot. So she's married to Charles Musgrove. We have Lady Russell, and she's a family friend and serves as a mother figure to Anne, and was the one who convinced Anne not to marry her love, Frederick Wentworth, because he didn't have position and station. She didn't do it out of ill will. She was trying to basically protect Anne as well as she could. And Lady Russell's not courting anybody, and that's not too surprising when we think about the role of female during this time period. She's in a very good position in terms of status and money, so she doesn't necessarily have to seek a mate. Sir Walter would be more likely to seek a mate in the sense that he would need somebody to care for him. And also he's having some financial difficulties, which is how the novel begins. More on that later. We also learn about Mrs. Musgrove. This is Charles Musgrove's mother. Louisa Musgrove, which happens to be the daughter of the Musgroves. In other words, that's the sister to Charles Musgrove. She's single, and she begins to be courted by Frederick Wentworth, in part because of her strong will, because she's not likely to be persuaded out of doing what she wants to do. Something that Anne was, that was Anne's weakness, is that Anne was able to be persuaded out of following her love for Wentworth. So he begins to court her because of her strong will. Henrietta Musgrove is also another daughter to the Musgroves, also another sister to Charles Musgrove. She too is single, and she's being courted by her cousin, Charles Hayter. We have a Mrs. Clay, and this happens to be Elizabeth's friend, and notice that the name is Mrs. She doesn't have a particular title. The concern is that she is perhaps after, one way or another, Sir Walter Elliot to get his money and to get his status. And she also, the reason why she is interacting with the family is because she's the daughter of the family lawyer, who happens to be Mr. Shepherd. Eventually, if you haven't gotten to the second book, we will be introduced to a Mrs. Smith. That happens to be Anne's friend. Again, another Mrs., somebody who isn't of royal station. This is somebody who is a widow and is not courting because she's in ill health and in ill financial prospects. And lastly, Mrs. Croft. She's married to Admiral Croft. That's Frederick Wentworth's sister, and she rents out Kellynch Hall. She's married. A couple of minor characters that are important in terms of forwarding the plot. Viscountess Dalrymple, Sir Walter Elliot's relative. Later on in the novel, we're going to find out about somebody who is above Sir Walter in the social scale and how he tries to impress this particular individual. And as I had indicated earlier, Mr. Shepherd, the family attorney, and he's important in terms of the beginning of the novel when we find out that basically Sir Walter is having financial difficulties. And some quotes here to give you an idea of the kind of marriage that he might have had with Lady Elliot. Lady Elliot, quote, had humored or softened or concealed, unquote, Sir Walter's failings. And though not the very happiest being in the world herself, had found enough in her duties, her friends, and her children to attach her to life. And after we read the story of an hour, that perhaps makes a certain level of sense. It's been 13 years since she's been dead. 13 is a rather ominous number. And we know that in those 13 years, Sir Walter has basically put himself into grave financial difficulty. And he's overcome with debt. And he has difficulty accepting the fact that he's going to have to, what they call retrench, or in other words, cut back on some of his expenses, because he's concerned about his comfort, and he's also concerned about the sense of appearance of what others might think if he has lost his fortune. And then the idea of the attorney, Mr. Shepherd, and Lady Russell, is that if the family were to vacate and to go someplace that was less expensive, if they were able to rent out their home under the guise of their vacating so that they could begin to travel and vacation, then this could be a way that they could acquire some money so that they can begin to pay off their debt and still maintain appearances. So basically, the Elliot family decides to vacation in Bath, which happens to be a very popular tourist place, especially for the wealthy, so Sir Walter can keep his sense of dignity. And in terms of renting out his home, he would do so under the guise of a favor, that it isn't so much that he wants to rent out his home, but it just turns out that there was somebody in need of a rental who knew the family attorney, and the family attorney just happened to know that the family was going to be vacating the home, and well, happy coincidence, everything works out so that the Crofts can basically rent that particular house. And Sir Walter is very pleased with this, in that they have a certain amount of status and respectability, but they can't overshadow him. They also don't have children, and their relationship is very interesting, particularly for this time period when relationships were basically determined again for social status and economic status. And basically the Crofts marry for love, and they don't marry because of children. That isn't what's keeping them together. What's keeping them together is their interest in one another. In fact, at one point, Mrs. Croft says the worst thing in a marriage is separation. So she accompanies her husband on his naval voyages, and that in and of itself would have seemed very unusual for the time period, that a woman would be seen as too delicate to be able to do that. She says that's ridiculous. So in some ways, we get to see images of women who are beginning to defy some of the social expectations of the time. Certainly, they are also products of their time. So when we learn about the Musgrove family, for instance, and they're supposed to be a much better representation than the Elliots, because they have hobbies and interests, and they allow their daughters to court and marry on their own. The Musgroves still come off as rather self-centered. Mary in particular, because she happens to be an Elliot. She suffers from hypochondria and continually needs attention. The Musgrove family, however, begins to rely on Anne, because as the Elliots leave to Bath, they leave Anne behind with the sister Mary. And that means that Anne becomes involved in the Musgrove household, which is considered to be, from Anne's perspective, a much more progressive household and less concerned with appearance and decorum. And as they begin to see Anne, they also begin to appreciate Anne in the way that Anne could never be appreciated by her own father. Whether that's because Anne doesn't have a mother in order to appreciate her, whether it's because Anne doesn't necessarily have some of the attributes of her other sisters. Anne is not nearly as vain or as self-centered, and basically the father, Sir Walter Elliot, is very vain and self-centered. But what we do see is that Anne begins to recapture her bloom as she begins to be accepted and valued by the Musgrove family, something that her own family was unable to do. And this happens to be Jane Austen's commentary on the idea of the landed gentry being very superficial and shallow, because the Musgroves, while they have a certain level of respectability and fortune, they're not nobility. So in many ways, it would seem that Mary married beneath her in some ways. And we see this at the very beginning when Sir Walter Elliot is spending all of his time looking at the Bartonage, that book that details the family history and how important it is what marriages occur and to whom in order to bring family honor, or his fear, family dishonor, upon the family name. The Musgroves happen to be connected to Frederick Wentworth. It turns out that the Musgroves have a dead son who was in the Navy, Richard, and Richard served under Wentworth. Again, it might seem like too much of a coincidence, but in a small social circle in a small geographic region, not that much of a coincidence that there would be connections with one another. And this fear of the Navy, here's a quote, of bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction, is definitely the anxiety that Sir Walter feels about individuals such as Frederick Wentworth coming and basically taking over the privilege and the status that somebody like Sir Walter would have had earlier. In terms of plot, this is a very slow-moving plot. We had talked a little bit about the idea of the author doing this deliberately to talk about the long, empty hours of leisure of these individuals and not necessarily knowing how to fill the time outside of planning social parties and thinking about ways to impress others. But what we do find, and this is supposed to be a major piece of action, is that the Musgrove child, little Charles Musgrove, falls and dislocates his collarbone. And at this point, neither of the parents want to stay and care for him because Frederick Wentworth is in town. This is very exciting that there is a new person in town and they want to meet him. So basically, Anne takes care of the child, but there's some wonderful passages there from Mary about how oftentimes caregiving and child rearing falls on the woman, and that's just not fair. If the father has the freedom to leave, she should have the freedom to leave as well. So if we think about the cult of true womanhood and some of the expectations for female, again, this is a subtle way for the author to make some commentary about some of the ways that those stereotypes may not necessarily be fair. And also, this idea of falling, since the child falls and dislocates his collarbone. There's a lot of falling that goes on in this novel. The idea of falling in love, and think about the term that we use with falling in love. And this idea of falling is usually negative, not positive. So if you think about falling in love, something that is not controlled, something that is not planned, something that can hurt, something that could even cause death. But at any rate, we're going to see another fall later on in terms of what is going to end the first volume of this 2-volume novel. And I thought what I would do is talk about that first volume today, and then I could continue on with talking about the second volume next class, and then begin with our next text. At any rate, we do learn about the major excitement that's going to be happening because Wentworth is in town and now everybody is in his social circle. The idea that he and those who are around his age, the young people, so to speak, as they're called by some of the older individuals, such as their parents, that they're going to visit Wentworth's friends in Lyme. That happens to be an adjoining town. His friends are the Harvilles. They're also involved, or the man was involved in the military. The Harvilles are supposed to be very similar in some ways to the Musgroves in that they don't necessarily have birth status, but they have something that's much more important. They have integrity, and they have passions, and they have hobbies, and they have interests, and they are nearly not as, or they're nowhere near as shallow and self-centered as the Elliot family is, with the exception of Anne. And then, of course, what we find out is that Louisa, one of the Musgrove daughters, is being wooed by Wentworth, and it makes sense because he's single. One of the reasons why he's attracted to her is because she maintains that she cannot be persuaded out of following her own will. And again, that's something that Anne was subject to doing, so Wentworth is very pleased by this. And she is so impulsive in wanting to walk along a wall, at the top of a wall, even though it's dangerous, and what ends up happening is that she falls and she hurts herself. Another theme in terms of falling. And that piece of action, the major piece of action in terms of the activity that's going on, results in her having to stay at the Harvilles and to recuperate. So basically, the first volume in Persuasion is devoted to Anne, mostly spending her time with her younger sister Mary at the Musgroves and being introduced to an entirely new world, one which is much more interesting than the world that she's been reared in, with living with her father and her sister, her older sister. And the second part of the book is the part of the book where Anne is going to be reuniting with her father and sister in Bath. So the first part of the book, we know that they left to go to Bath. And the second part of the book, Anne is going to be leaving her sister and reuniting with the Elliot family. But she's going to be a very different kind of person now that she's had all of these experiences with the Musgroves and the Wentworths. In other words, she's blooming not just physically, but she's also blooming emotionally, and she's blooming intellectually as well. In terms of today's attendance question, which I've got listed and I will put on our forum as well, is based on what you've read so far, which character do you respect or like the most, and why? So as you can see, the kinds of questions I ask are not necessarily questions that have right or wrong answers, but they are questions that hopefully will make you think a little bit and perhaps might provoke some discussion and conversation. So again, out of all of the characters you've read, and I'm well aware you may not have finished the novel, but at least up until the point that you are now, which character do you think you like and or respect the most, and some of the reasons why? So I hope you're doing well. I am doing well. And I will continue next class by talking about the second volume to Persuasion, and then we can forge ahead. Take care. Bye-bye.